We're bringing you boots on the ground insight from the ranchers, conservationists, and partners who are helping to preserve the best of the Golden State for generations to come. Join the California Rangeland Trust for inspiring stories of resilience, innovation, and hope as we get tuned into the land.
Hello and welcome to this special bonus episode of Tune Into the Land. I am your host, Michael Delbar, CEO of the California Rangeland Trust. Like today and 2 decades ago, agriculture across the West faced an uncertain future. Industrialization and urbanization posed a threat to the region's vast and unique private rangelands and grasslands. In 2004, 6 land trusts, each with an affiliation to their state's livestock trade associations, banded together to help keep working lands in working hands. Since then, this West-wide consortium, called the Partnership of Rangeland Trusts, or PORT for short, has expanded to include 9 member organizations across 12 states. PORT members are committed to advocating for the conservation of working lands and Western heritage for the benefit and well-being of future generations. Now in its second decade, PORT is celebrating 20 years of conserving working lands together. As a proud member of PORT, we thought it'd be fitting during this anniversary year to bring you a special bonus episode of Tune Into the Land with a few of our PORT colleagues and friends. Joining us today, we have Erik Glenn, PORT President and Executive Director of the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, Jessica Crowder, Executive Director of the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust, and Chad Ellis, Executive Director of the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. So with that, I'd like to welcome Erik, Chad, and Jessica to the podcast. Why don't we start off telling us a little bit about each of you? If you want to kick us off, Erik.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, for having us and for kicking off PORT's 20th anniversary celebration with this podcast. As Michael said, I'm Erik Glenn. I'm the president of the Partnership of Rangeland Trust and the executive director of one of its members, the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust. I've spent now close to 17 years. Hard to believe, it's went by fast with CCALT, and most of those I've been involved with PORT, which has always been this wonderful experience of collaboration and connection with like-minded conservation organizations from across the West and Midwest.
Jessica?
I am Jessica Crowder. Thank you, Michael, for hosting us today. It's really exciting to be a part of PORT's 20th anniversary. And I am, as you said, the executive director of the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust. Been in this position for about 4 years. The Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust is a land trust that has conservation easements on over 300,000 acres in Wyoming. We're actually our state's only agricultural land trust and the only statewide land trust as well that doesn't operate in a national capacity. So we're really excited to be, part of this amazing group and enjoy working with the colleagues of PORT and excited for this opportunity as well. Go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Chad Ellis, CEO of Texas Agricultural Land Trust, and great. Just like everyone, Michael, appreciate you bringing us together and us celebrate PORT and talk about PORT and the importance of what the Partnership of Rangeland Trust, really means to our landowners and stewards across the country. We're about the same size as California and Wyoming, a little over 300,000 acres. I think the more important beyond the acres is, we've helped 50 families. And to me, that's the great part. And then we just 2 years ago opened up an office in Oklahoma and starting to help landowners across the river as well.
Great. So for our listeners, when we talk about the Partnership of Rangeland Trust, or PORT as we've been calling it, it has 9 members working in 12 different states across the West and the Midwest. It's the California Rangeland Trust, Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Land Trust, the Northwest Rangeland Trust, which is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Ranchland Trust of Kansas, Montana Land Reliance, Nebraska Land Trust, South Dakota Ag Land Trust, and of course, Texas Agricultural Land Trust and the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust. So That's a lot to say, but it's an organization that's done a lot of good work. So, Erik, as the president of Port, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what Port does and why it was formed?
Sure. So, celebrating 20 years. So, if you go back to 2004, the landscape of conservation looked quite a bit different in the West, in the Midwest. And there wasn't the wide acceptance of conservation easements on agricultural lands that I would argue there is today, and largely because of the organizations that make up Port, which have completely transformed conservation. And they've transformed conservation by putting people at the center and creating opportunity for ag producers to build conservation easements in a way that works for their operation, and with organizations that understand their operations. And so Port really was designed to be a entity and an organization and a place for like-minded organizations that wanted to focus on ag land conservation, that had some inherent characteristics in common, first and foremost being that we had an affiliation with a state livestock organization. For us to come together and share best practices, for us to come together and collaborate on how to advance conservation incentives and conservation policy that work for ag producers. And again, you're going to hear this time and again from this panel, and you hear it from Michael and the CRT team all the time, is that we put people at the forefront of conservation. And we focus on that. And we focus on the ability for people to maintain a livelihood. We focus on the forefront of helping our rural communities find resiliency and come back and to a place of economic prominence, or at least economic sustainability. And that's really the focus. And so, these organizations came together. We said, we want to do something to advance ag working lands conservation in the West and the Midwest. And over time, the membership's grown. Texas came out of this whole idea of building these ag-focused land trusts. And when Texas was in their formation period, they looked to Port for inspiration on how to create a really special and unique land trust that can make conservation work in a state like Texas really well. South Dakota, same way. And so as Port has evolved over time, our membership has expanded. But again, we maintain these characteristics and these membership requirements that are really tied to producer organizations, that are tied to this philosophy that we put people at the forefront of conservation, and that we are organizations that are working across our individual states or beyond regionally. And it's, I think as Chad likes to say, and it's important, right? It's the people, the number of people that we're working with. And it's, collectively, these 9 organizations worked with more than 1,800 families across the West and Midwest, conserve 3.2 million acres. When we put the people first, when we let people know it's the landowners that are driving the conservation, we're just there to help them facilitate that. Conservation can happen at scale. Conservation can happen in a resilient way. And Port really is at the forefront of helping all of our organizations do that better, and hopefully leading to better conservation across the country.
So 20 years ago, the original founding members of Port were Colorado, California, Wyoming, Montana, Kansas, and at the time, Oregon Rangeland Trust, which is now the Northwest Rangeland Trust. But it was really Wyoming and Colorado that spurred the initial conversation. Jessica, was there anything, I know this was before any of our times as executives, that when Port was formed, but was there anything that you know of that was the catalyst for that initial conversation, or was it just a recognition that something had to be done?
Yeah. Michael, I reached out to some of our founding members of the Partnership of Rangeland Trusts. And it was a really interesting and inspiring conversation. And one of the things that I heard from Ogden Driscoll, one of our founders, was the recognition that joining together would provide meaningful representation for ag land conservation, for the landowners that we work with, and for our land trusts. And, from my understanding of those conversations, just recognizing that advocating for working lands conservation, for ag land conservation, it was difficult when we were all smaller, more towards the beginning of our own organization's beginnings. And this really just gave us an opportunity to, as Erik said, advocate together, share best practices with one another. And really that recognition of what we could do together and the difference we could make was incredibly important at that time and continues to be so today.
Chad, is that what was appealing to TALT to become part of PORT?
Yeah, absolutely. And Erik kind of, hit on this a little bit, Michael, is TALT is the only, ag focused land trust in the state and the only state, wide organization. And when you start looking at it, we look at our founding members of TALT, of Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, Texas Farm Bureau, and Texas Wildlife Association, which was our three, major grassroots producer-led organizations in the state, as they started looking at needing more tools and needing that trusted source to help, the landowners and producers across the state. It didn't take us long to kind of look beyond the state lines to, what is that model? What do we need to do? And that's where PORT has helped us from the beginning and still helping us today. I mean, I think we all cherish the memberships and those, the 9 organizations, and rely on one another to help us, be better and be able to provide back to our landowners the services that they need.
As we mentioned, PORT member organizations are in the West and the Midwest. What do you all think sets PORT members apart from other conservation groups in the country? What makes PORT unique?
Well, I would just go back to what I mentioned earlier. One is it's this philosophy that people come first, that if we want durable, lasting conservation at scale, we have to recognize that it's the land stewards, the land owners that are going to deliver that. A land trust, in my opinion, there's not a land trust in this country that's going out there really and delivering conservation at scale. They have to have a landowner that's going to be their partner. And if we all realize that and recognize that, and that we build conservation in a way that works for those landowners, conservation will happen in a much more durable and at a scale that's at a level that regardless of what your reasons for wanting to do conservation, that conservation will happen. And it's PORT that's driving this idea, and its members are driving this idea that we got to put the people first, and we empower those land stewards to do what they do really well. Then you're going to have this really tremendous conservation. So that people-centered thing is what I think first and foremost makes PORT unique. Secondly is this affiliation with our state ag organizations. In Chad's case, you got Farm Bureau and the livestock group in Texas that have come together. Same in South Dakota. Colorado, we're in Wyoming, we're tied to our stock growers, our Cattlemen's group. Same with you guys, I think, in California. And we don't have that broader piece yet that ties in that farming side as formally, but those formal relationships with those groups is really important, and it gives our producer members some certainty of how we're going to operate, having that connection, because most of these livestock trade organizations, farming trade organizations, been around for a long, long time. And their fundamental principles have always been be advocates for that private property owner. And we're going to do that same thing. Those two things really are, in my mind, the unique elements that make port and its members unique and able to deliver conservation at a significant scale and in a more durable and resilient way.
And I would add to that having that affiliation with those producer groups, with those agricultural groups, really does keep our organizations grounded, keeps us centered on the people part of it, keeps us always considering what is the impact of this conservation? How are we working with landowners and agricultural producers? What services are we providing to them? Are we meeting their needs? And it gives us kind of an ear to the ground. What are their needs? And those organizations that we're affiliated with help us with that. And I think that's incredibly important to keep that people focus and to keep that agricultural focus, is to be affiliated with those organizations. And it just makes us stronger and able to act in a manner that is impactful for the people we work with.
Yeah, I can't add much more, Michael. I think we're in the relationship business first and conservation business second. And we all have this foundation that we all utilize, which are our guiding principles, which we all, keep one accountable around that, right? To help that. And that's, it takes stewards, stewardship requires stewards of the land, and we try to help empower them, and based around those private property rights. And, those are the kind of the key components, and, having those partnerships back to our agricultural, roots is key. And I think that's what really separates us from everyone else.
I know, and here in California, we always talk about the fact that our board members are all ranchers, and it's the industry's brothers and sisters that are running the organization, and that adds that trust factor into the relationships that we've done, and it results in the success that we've had. We've talked a lot about conservation, and while there's different ways of conserving the land and doing conservation practices on these working ranches, the one tool that we all use the most is the conservation easement. So, Chad, for those that are unfamiliar with an easement can you briefly give a quick synopsis of what is a conservation easement?
Sure. Yeah, a conservation easement is, kind of a legal document, right? It's a glue to make sure that we're, meeting the goals and objectives of those landowners. And really what it's about is keeping those conservation values and highlighting those for future generations. Mainly, we're just holding development rights to keep our working lands working, keep those farms and ranches, providing for their families and operations and to the citizens of the states.
Jessica, what's that mean for the ranching family that enters into one of these?
Yeah, for the ranching family that enters into a conservation easement, there's really, first of all, a lot of consideration of what do you think the future of your ranch or your farm looks like, and that's leading up to the conservation easement itself. And I think it's really important for families to go through that process. They really are thinking about and planning for the future. And part of that planning for the future is thinking about succession planning, and conservation easements are a very good tool for succession planning, for passing land on to the next generation or to the next producer, whoever that may be. It really does provide an opportunity for agriculturalists of the future to access land, to keep an opportunity open for agricultural production. And I think that's incredibly important for ranching families. We see our ranching families use the conservation easement in so many different ways because there is often a financial benefit with a conservation easement. Ranching families can use those funds to purchase more agricultural land, more working lands. They can use those funds for habitat enhancement or restoration projects. We often see them using funds for infrastructure projects, just to help their operations. And one of the interesting things that we also hear from ranching families is that they're thinking about the future in bigger ways now. So there's a recognition that access to land for agriculture and the economic viability of agriculture is difficult right now. And so we have a lot of ranching families working together to think about how a conservation easement and perhaps the financial benefit from that can set up a long-term trust or endowment or mechanism to really help continue that agricultural operation and maybe pay for some of that agricultural operation in the future, which is really exciting to see these unique ways that landowners are thinking about conservation easements as a way to keep ag on the land, to keep wildlife habitat intact and all of the other benefits provided. There's really a legacy piece there, and that's coming to light and being thought through with these landowners.
So what does that mean for the general public? What benefit does the public see? We hear this question all the time. What's in it for the general public when conserving these private working ranches?
Well, I think just to start, keeping open space, which is what ranching properties are. It's inherently that is a economic benefit to the public in the states where these exist and in their communities. One, undeveloped land is far less costly to service for county services. If you want to look at it that way. Two, having land function the way that nature intended it to function, which is what properly and well-managed ranch land does, drives a significant economic benefit back to the public and to communities as well. We did some analysis with Colorado State University that looked at for every dollar the state of Colorado forgoes in tax revenue to incentivize conservation, that the state receives between $31 and $49 in benefit. And that benefit's not just one time, it's a benefit that goes on year after year after year. So if you multiply that, assume the lowest return on value, if you multiply that across Port's 3.2 million acres, you're talking about almost $1 billion of economic value per year back to the public. And those are things like keeping soil carbon in the ground. It's natural mitigation of flooding impacts. It's wildlife habitat. It's water quality. It's all these things that the public never pays for and has never paid for, and that the landowners have actually never been compensated for in terms of stewarding those. And that's on the economic side. But on the community side, to Jessica's point about succession, and I think this is what's most important for us, is that we're giving opportunities to that next generation and future generations to come back, reinvest in their communities, keep those rural communities strong and thriving. And I always like to share the story of these families down in Southeast Colorado that came together in the early 2000s, late 1990s, to do conservation that allowed the next generation to come back to the ranch. And through the conservation easement projects, they learned about funders who then came back in and supported an equine events center in their community. They built this center. It's become really the hub of activity in a 4-state region in Southeast Colorado, all because we reinvested in people that want to stay and invest in their communities. They were able to rebuild or to build a new school in that community. And we've really seen this kind of resiliency within a rural community that was really catalyzed by conservation and keeping families that have a connection to that landscape in this landscape and in these communities. I think that's what's most important to focus on in terms of what benefits the public and benefits all of us.
Chad or Jessica, anything to add to that?
That's the core, right? I think, Michael, Erik's done some of those economic, California Rangeland Trust, you've done some of that work as well as so has Talt. We see the same numbers. It's astounding, I think some of it too, right, is how do we take some of this analysis and sort of give it the flip side of the conversation? Not only is it, the importance and the value of it, but we also need to start talking about, here's the value, but we're losing so many acres. We're losing over 1,000 acres a day here in Texas. And, I don't know what that number is, Erik. We probably should run those numbers of port members, in a day out of our 12 states we were working in, how much of that working lands are we losing in a day? And what's the economic impact? And, I think security, there's so many things that sometimes we overlook. And I think that's what happens. I think in our field, we talk to ourselves, we make assumptions because we're so used to it. We're so ingrained in these issues, and we don't really take the time to fully tell the story. And that's what I appreciate about port, and that we're always thinking about all of these things and bringing this data back to policymakers, things and the communities to show that importance of our working lands.
As one of you mentioned, port members across 12 states have partnered with over 2,000 ranching families to conserve more than 3.2 million acres. That's pretty dang impressive on its own. Now, 2 decades after port was started, we're still unfortunately seeing the disappearing lands across the West and the Midwest. Earlier this year, there was a 2022 Census of Agriculture released, and that showed an alarming decline of over 141,000 farms and ranches across the U.S. being lost. 7,300 of those right here in California. Now, that's compared to just 5 years earlier, and a loss of more than 20 million acres during that same time frame. Now, this comes on top of a study by American Farmland Trust that estimates 18.4 million acres of farm and ranch land could be lost to development and conversion by 2040. That's the size of the state of South Carolina. Now, we've been using a number of 2,000 acres across the United States being lost today. But Chad, this last week, we just returned from the Working Lands Innovation Summit in Texas that TALT put on. And you mentioned that the loss in Texas alone was over 1,000 acres. That's an incredible number.
Yeah, it's a stock, put it in perspective, right? TALT has been around 17 years, and we basically have helped 50 families, 300,000 acres put conservation, right? We're losing roughly, 375,000 acres in 1 year. So our work in 17 years doesn't even, equal out to what we lose in a year. And, you start adding the population increase here in Texas of 1,400 people moving to the state daily. It's 500,000 people a year. This is the nexus, right? And this aspect of this fragmentation, and how do we slow this down? How do we, help those families? And we look at our age of our family, operations, and our landowners are over 65 years of age. Michael, and just in Texas, we have 141 million acres of private farms and ranches and timber, forestry type operations. We're going to see a third of those transfer in some sort from a seller to the next generation in the next few years. We're going to see the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth that we've ever seen in our nation, right? These are things that you talk about the importance of port. This is the key. Why? This is the importance of port, of our 9 organizations coming together. We can't solve these issues and think of the solutions to keep our families back on the land. And that's where we lean on one another and gain from one another of our board members of better ideas or other thoughts, and help drive innovations and solutions that we can scale.
When we talk about the loss of acres and the loss of ranches and farms and the loss of those stewards of the land that we lose with those, but we lose so much more than just acres.
Oh, yeah.
Communities lose everything from the local feed stores to butcher shop to all of the things that make a community what it is. We lose those as well. So it's not just acres. It's not just farm ranches.
Right.
One of the things that Port has been extremely successful on is that policy advocacy that you just referenced, Chad. It is really interesting and fun to see the attention that Port members get when they walk the halls of Congress. You've got folks from all 9 members and even some other supporters. Our ranching partners are there too, walking the halls with hats and boots, and it gets attention. But Port's had some tremendous policy successes. Talk a little bit about what those advocacy efforts are in DC and how successful those have been.
Sure. Well, I think it is remarkable to think that an organization that for most of its life has had an annual operating budget of less than $17,000 a year, no paid staff, has had the impact on policy at a federal level that we have had. And Port was instrumental in the, particularly the success of the 2018 Farm Bill. And really it comes down to the people involved in Port. Jessica talked about Ogden Driscoll, who was one of the early Port folks, who's now he was, I don't know if he still is, but was president of the Wyoming State Senate. Really influential voice for agriculture and for working lands conservation. You had Chad's predecessor, Blair Fitzsimmons, who, you go to DC with Blair and you're sitting down with all the members, and I'm talking about the members themselves of the Texas delegation. She could get in to those meetings, and Chad can do the same thing. And in leading up to that 2018 Farm Bill, Mike Conaway was the chair of the House Ag Committee. He's now on the TALT board. That's the kind of influence that Port had, but it wasn't just on the House side. The Senate side, Mike Beam, who's now the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of Kansas, still on the Port board, had a personal relationship with the chair of the Senate Ag Committee at the time, Pat Roberts. And when you have those relationships, it makes things work really well. But, those relationships only happen if you're willing to go in and invest in the time of building those relationships. And that's what has made Port special, is our members go back to DC 2 to 3 to 4 times a year and invest in building relationships with the members. They invest in building relationships with committee staff, the staff of the members that are really influential to getting work done in that policy realm. And so, everybody wants to say that policy work at the federal level takes a lot of money, and it does. It's not cheap, but you can do it by just also spending the time going in and building relationships and strategically investing funds where appropriate. And that's where Port's been really, I think, effective, is that we leverage the relationships that we have, and we leverage partnerships beyond the formal members. And we have great relationships with the Vermont Land Trust. We have great relationships with the Grand Traverse Regional Conservancy in Michigan. We have great relationships with NCBA and with Farm Bureau and with like-minded other conservation and ag industry groups, and with conservation groups that are outside of Port. And we've found ways to bring all those together to leverage relationships and go out and spend the time going back to DC and advocating for conservation that works for producers. Again, all of it goes back to advocating for what producers need and want. And I think that's, at the end of the day, what makes this work, is that when we go back to DC, it's not just the staff, it is landowners that are coming back with us, including landowners who don't even have easements, but believe that easements are a tool that we need to keep on the table for landowners, both now and in the future.
You mentioned the Farm Bill, Erik, and that's the tool that funds a lot of our easements in our states to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And that's theoretically every 5 years, a little bit give and take to that timeline as we're seeing right now. But talk a little bit about Port's Conservation Easement 101 exercise with the congressional staff. We've done that 2 or 3 times. It's been extremely successful. What do you see the value of continuing to do that type of education with the folks that are drafting the language that goes into these farm bills?
Well, I think it's critical, one, that we go and provide the education for staff and for members about how this works. We disavow certain misconceptions about easements, and we bring landowners who can talk about how it has a direct impact on what they're doing and how that impact has been positive. And look, we'll talk about the challenges with easements as well, because in the challenges lie the opportunity to build better policy solutions. And so really being transparent in that education is pretty critical. But if we're not talking about how the mechanics of these things work and what the impacts they're having on the ground at landowners, then we're doing a disservice in the policy function to the policymakers and those, and taking one step further to the agencies that are tasked with implementing it as well. And so, I have to credit Blair and Chad, who have really maintained close relationships with folks who have deep Texas ties that are on these committee staff and within the members who have allowed us the access to go in and do these workshops, which have been really, really effective. And then we also have to recognize our partners, Land Trust Alliance, American Farmland Trust, who have helped facilitate these discussions as well. But they're super effective. They're super important and have been critical to our policy successes.
When the first Easement 101 we did, I remember a long time, I believe she was a Senate Ag Committee staffer, made the comment when we were done that she got more out of that session than she has got out of the agencies and the information up in her career. And I thought that was pretty impactful, that showed that what we were doing in bringing the truth, the real life experiences, and how the Farm Bill programs work or don't work for the producers. There's a lot of misconceptions about easements and something that we deal with day in and day out. Chad or Jessica, how do you contend with some of the misinformation about what conservation easements are and what they are not?
Michael, I think one of the most important parts of the conversation around conservation easements is that conservation easements are a private property right. They are voluntary, and they have significant impact for those families that choose to use that voluntary tool. And so one of the things that's incredibly important to the people that we work with as Port members, I think in each of our states, is that the opportunity to use the tool of a conservation easement to meet your conservation goals, to meet your financial goals, to meet your goals for your agricultural operation, your succession planning goals, having that opportunity remain is incredibly important to agricultural families. And that's really, the heart of it is we don't want to remove tools that are in our toolbox. Essentially, we want to continue to provide that opportunity, and as a land trust, we want to continue to provide that service to our producers and our landowners in each of our states. And it's just incredibly important to keep that in mind, that it is a private property right and it is voluntary, and it does really come with opportunities that we want to have for families in the future. Chad, what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, that's well said. I mean, both Erik and Jessica has always just kind of articulated both ends of, one, the importance of our policy and the relationships and the investments in that, right? And I think I'm going to answer kind of both in a way. Michael, that kind of all comes together in my mind is, I think first when we think about the policy and some of that, because it starts with kind of, I think, the myths and perceptions on what's going on. I think on the policy, those staffers, they have to know, a lot of different things, right? There's lots of policy. They're not just working on, conservation or agriculture. And I think us being able to take that time and help educate them really helps. I think it also strengthens that relationship. So when they have those questions, we are the experts, right? And they can make those phone calls, and we help guide that. I think at the same time, when we think of, those myths on the other side, and I would say, oppositions, right, on the other side that are pushing back. I think Erik started off of court in our founding time. There were a lot of folks that weren't really keen on conservation easements, right? And I think all of us have talked about, especially in the port and our structure and those partnerships, again, and those relationships, we have a demand like we've never seen before, ever. And it's not just our individual states, but I think it all comes down to the relationships. I think also it's our landowners talking to one another, right? And the more easements we put, and we don't promote anything. It's landowners talking to one another and saying, this is why it works for me. Again, it's a tool. It's not the right tool for every situation or every family. And that's the other key. And I think the key really comes down to it. Jessica nailed it. It's voluntary, and it's the ultimate step, right? When we think about a conservation ethic, this is the ultimate step of that private, exercising that private property right, of executing a conservation easement to put generations, and in some families, generational stewardship, to make sure it's there for future generations as far as we can think of.
Very well said. And I think Port, through our individual and collective efforts, have done a lot to try to just present the facts, present what really it constitutes a good conservation easement, what makes up a bad one. There's a recognition that there are some not good easements out there, but those aren't ones that come from any of our port members. But we do the best we can to really put that truth out there, again, collectively and as a port. We're looking forward to the 2024 Farm Bill one of these days. The 28 Farm Bill, I think we got a lot of successes. Our punch list of goals was pretty well met. What do you all think in terms of the 24 bill and what we're hearing? Are we going to be as successful in getting the changes that we like to see made for the benefit of our landowner partners?
Well, Michael, I think we should reflect on kind of just the major accomplishment in 2018, which was to remove the non-federal cash match requirement. And what that's done to enable conservation in places like Montana and Texas, and I would say probably in Wyoming, is pretty significant. And it's not just Western states that are benefiting, but everybody wants to talk about inclusivity and equity and all this, and yet we have all these policy provisions that exist out there that are meant to keep people out of doing these activities, and that non-federal cash match was a good example of that. You couldn't do conservation using those Farm Bill programs in Texas. It was Port that advocated for removing that. We made the arguments that persuaded Congress to do that. And I think that may be the single most important thing Port's done from a policy point of view to make conservation work better for producers. And so as we look ahead to 24, how can we match that? Maybe we can't match the specific impact of that, but what we can do is continue to find the barriers to conservation. And we do that through listening to landowners, listening to to the port members, what are they struggling with? And we built a really robust policy platform that's been really mirrored by American Farmland Trust and to a large extent the Land Trust Alliance and some others, and worked hard to get those provisions into the what ultimately will become the Farm Bill. Whether or not we get it done this Congress is still a major question mark. But what we've seen come out of the House version was, I think, about 95% of the stuff we wanted. Again, it goes back to the relationships. It goes back to the work that our members put in to go back to DC, to take landowners back to DC. I think some of the big ones, provisions that are in that House version, are the elimination of the adjusted gross income limitations and also eliminating some additional kind of federal requirements within these easements. And it's a recognition that I think the House specifically understands that we have to remove barriers. We remove barriers and we enable groups like Colorado Cattlemen's, Wyoming Stock Growers, Rangeland Trust of Kansas, Nebraska Land Trust to deliver conservation the way we know how to deliver it, which is at a really high standard, that we can help these producers stay on their land, transition that land to the next generation, keep our communities strong and resilient. And I'm optimistic we can get something done in this Congress still, most likely in the lame duck. We'll see how that goes. I've told the port members to be on standby if we need to come back to DC. We're ready to go back for one last push. But there is reason to be optimistic. And if we don't get it done in this Congress, hey, we're right back at it. We know what we're advocating for, and we'll keep working at it.
What has been an amazing 20 years for port, but what's in store for the next 20? What do y'all think?
Well, I'll start. I think as an organization that operates in Wyoming, we are, we're just incredibly blessed. We have a small population. We still maintain a lot of our open spaces. We are losing lands to agriculture, but not at the same rate as, Chad or our neighbors to the south in Colorado, our neighbors to the north in Montana. So I feel like the opportunity is immense in all of our states and in Wyoming to really make a difference. Very selfishly, as a member of port, that's an opportunity for us to learn from other port members who are experiencing growth, experiencing the loss of working lands at a much faster rate, and are already putting tools in place to meet landowner needs and landowner interest in conservation of those working lands. And so I see in the next 20 years, port just continuing to provide the training and the support and the advocacy for those pieces that really are essential for us to conserve ag lands. And, for a state like Wyoming, that's incredibly important because it builds those tools and provides that support and that training in advance of our hours of greatest need, I guess I would say. So I see that as tremendously valuable for the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust and other land trusts really across our nation. It's not just providing that opportunity for our port members. It's setting up opportunities for success for everybody who works in this space, which is really exciting to me for the next 20 years.
Chad or Erik?
I'll jump in before Erik because he's going to steal the thunder. I think a lot of it, right, is just what else? What other tools can we bring to the table? We go back to the families, right? And we're seeing, I know Talt's not any different than our other port members. We're seeing a lot of these families already that we have conservation easements that have taken that step in conservation, already handing over to the next generation. And how do we help that next generation with other tools? Is that carbon markets? Is that water markets, biodiversity markets? is that things that we haven't even thought of, right? And that's where the innovation, I think, comes about. And the members of Port, as Erik has said, we're listening to those landowners and those land stewards across the country and hearing from them, and us kind of coming together and brainstorming of their needs. And we're much different than other organizations. It's not just kind of in one ear, out the other. It's in one ear, and it's kind of, floating in this, 6 inches between our ears of really trying to find solutions. And so I'm excited about that part, not only helping empower those families, even, with new tools, but also maybe it's the other side of us gaining, stronger relationships with, families and helping them implement some tools. And then when the timing is right, we can add, the conservation easement and have those relationships.
Erik, your thunder.
For me, I'd love to see us continue to grow the membership Port. And by that, I mean, there are states right now that are not served by organizations that have the ag focus that we, the Port members, have. I'd love to work with NCBA, American Farm Bureau, more closely to build ag focused conservation organizations in states that currently don't have them. I think that's really important. We need producer-centric organizations to help and assist landowners in all 50 states that steward working landscapes, in my opinion. So I think that's really important. And then Chad hit on it. I think the future of conservation for all of us is in what I call additive conservation. How do we build other outcomes on top of already conserved lands? How do we continue to be a valuable partner to those landowners that have agreed to partner with us to help them make their operations more effective, both from an agricultural standpoint and a conservation standpoint? That's where we have real opportunity to win. That's the part that gets me really excited, and our team, I think, really excited, and I think the Port members excited. How can we continue to layer things on top to help that next generation, and again, help the rural communities be resilient and strong, and because they really do make up a critical component and fabric of our country. And that's not to take away from the urban areas at all. We all play a role in this, and I wish the urban areas would recognize the importance of rural communities more. And I think that's all beholden upon us to go out and educate people why these things are important, why our communities are important, and start breaking down these divides that have artificially popped up because of politics more than anything real, and get back to building a great future for the future generations of our country.
Well said. I know from the California Rangeland Trust standpoint, having the resources that all of our fellow members of Port provide, and the leadership, the foresight, it's an honor to be part of this organization, and it's a personal honor to be associated with all of you, and being able to pick up the phone and call and say, "Hey, I've got a problem, or I've got a question," and knowing that resource is there for us. I'm excited about Port's next 20 years. There's a lot of changes on the forefront. Port has grown tremendously just in the last probably 10 years. And I see a lot of opportunity as well in what we can do and bridging that rural-urban divide, bringing that education forward and showing folks just what we do. And we've seen that here in California when we tell our story about the benefits that our working lands, private landowner partners are doing every day. People are amazed. And by being able to catapult that amongst all of our 9 members, and I know that that's going to hopefully increase as time goes on and make Port an even stronger organization. I want to thank all 3 of you for taking time out of your extremely busy schedules to be part of this Port 20th anniversary podcast, and wish you all the best of luck in getting those conservation projects done, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you for being a part of this.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, we also want to thank you, Michael, and the rest of California Rangeland Trust, all the work you guys do as well. And that's the beauty about Port. Every one of us are passionate for those land stewards, and you guys are the best of the best, and we appreciate y'all.
We hope that you enjoyed hearing from some of our Port partners and celebrating the success of our collective organization over the last 20 years. If you want to learn more about the work the Port is doing, you can visit the website at rangelandtrusts.org. This closes the gate on this bonus episode of Tune Into the Land. Make sure you tune in next Tuesday to hear our regularly scheduled episode with Patrick and Bobbin Mulvaney of Mulvaney's B&L in downtown Sacramento. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to leave us a review. We want to hear from you. Make sure you hit that follow button so you can be notified when the next episode is released. Thanks for listening.